Hello everybody, and welcome to your Week 6 lecture at Harvard Graduate School of Design. The theme of this week is Design and the Environment, and today's lecture is titled, What's the Point of Art When the World is Ending? How art has responded to the environmental crises of the Anthropocene. So I've been looking forward to giving this lecture in person because there's a lot of things that I would really like your feedback on, a lot of things that I have unresolved in my mind. And I think that through this lecture, I'm hoping that I can bring these to you and we can discuss them in person when we meet in our seminar this Wednesday. So, to some extent, the world has always seemed a little bit like it's in crisis. That's certainly true of a lot of apocalyptic art. For example, here in 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius is erupting, natural disaster, and destroying Pompeii. Here we see the Black Death sweeping across Europe in the 1300s, and you can see these skeleton-like figures attacking everyone. Work by Bruegel, very beautiful. And probably you know this piece. This is a work by Pablo Picasso, 1937, called Guernica. The town of Guernica was bombed by Nazis during the Spanish Civil War. So, quite apocalyptic. Art, in many ways, always has been. However, much recent scholarship, including both our seminar readings this week, have claimed that our age is a little bit different. Davis and Turpin have linked contemporary movements in art and design to the Anthropocene Thesis, with Corner discussing the climate crisis and shifts in our environmental imagination. And both of these, as we'll see, pertain to the future somewhat. As we will explore throughout this lecture, many are questioning the role of art in the face of the apocalypse, which is evoking themes of environmental catastrophe, a fear of and desire to change the future, a shift in individual thought to co-creation and participation in art, and a new emphasis on pedagogy. Bang! Problem solved. So, today, first of all, I'm going to talk about the Anthropocene Thesis. I want to talk about why it's considered to be a particular crisis point for humanity. After that, we're going to talk about art and environmental imagination, and here we are going to engage with the concerns of our key seminar text for this week, Davis and Turpin's Art and the Anthropocene and Corner's Terra Fluxus. And I'm going to provide art and design examples throughout that section. After that, we'll go to an in-depth case study. It's actually a project from my studio from about a decade ago. It's a private public commission in South Korea. And because it's my project, I can give you some in-depth background information and we can really pull it apart and analyse it. Then we're going to work with reflections and provocations. What is the use of art? Does it make sense that we're talking about art as having a use? And who is it that's deciding what use art has? After all of that, we're going to conclude. I want to address the question, what is the point of art when the world is ending? So we'll give that a go. So the term Anthropocene was popularised by atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen in the early 2000s. He says human activities are exerting increasing impacts on the environment on all scales, in many ways outcompeting natural processes. The belief was that humans have become a geological force on par with ice ages, asteroid impacts, and tectonic shifts. With this in mind, let's look at the etymology. So anthropos comes from the Greek for human, and scene refers to the Cenozeme, a geological era that we are currently living through. Together, this makes Anthropocene. And whilst widely discussed, the Anthropocene is a proposed epoch and not officially recognised by geological authorities. So what is a geological epoch? Well, it's a subdivision of geological time. You can see on the right there. They are planetary scale changes in climate and life, and they're determined and characterised by geological and biological events. Let's take, for example, the Pleistocene epoch. This is the one just before the one that we're living through now. Geological records show that this was characterised by repeated ice ages and saw the rise of early humans. It ended with the mass extinction of megafauna like mammoths and saber-toothed cats. So, The Holocene, now marked in red, is our current epoch. This is marked by a retreat of glaciers and a rise of agriculture and cities. This is a tomb painting where we can see early agriculture. In order to ratify a new epoch, the International Commission on Stratigraphy would need to designate a golden spike to mark a clear beginning. And you can see here, it is literally a golden spike, which is pegged into the strata. However, those proposing the thesis have debated its beginnings. For example, Paul Crutzen, who is the originator of this term, suggested that James Watts's design for the steam engine in 1784 would be the symbolic start of the Industrial Revolution, and therefore that might count as the beginning of this period. Others have suggested that actually, if we're talking about agriculture, deforestation, and the change in land use, perhaps more early Anthropocene theses might make sense. So here's an artist impression of farming in Celtic Britain. Most, however, point to the Great Acceleration, which is a period post-World War II which saw a dramatic surge in human activity and its impact on the Earth, and that is around the last 70 years, so shockingly recent and still within memory. So on the hunt for the beginning of this period, it's often cited that the hydrogen bomb tests in the 1950s and 60s might be key markers. So here we can see Ivy Mike, which is the first ever hydrogen bomb detonated in 1952. Here, one in 1954, one in 1957. And this is an artist impression of the radioactive isotopes from the first ever hydrogen bomb. This refers to that kind of period of isotopes which are now within the strata of the Earth. So other industrial markers of the Anthropocene include unprecedented levels of extractivism, such as coal, oil and gas. And for example, here we can see lithium evaporation ponds in northern Chile. Other markers include post-war artificial fertilizer. These disrupt the natural nitrogen cycle of the Earth. The invention of new, non-degradable materials such as plastic, and here we can see plastic has begun to enter sedimentary records, such as this example in Spain. And even chicken bones have been described as possible markers for the Anthropocene. They are industrially modified creatures. Their skeletons, we can see that they're modified by humans, and they're found in sediment layers globally. Other markers of ecological collapse, for example, are life form extinctions, which have reached higher levels than ever before in history, 70% reduction in the population size of wild animals, coral reef bleaching, ocean acidification, and mass marine die-offs, the human population explosion, which is so extreme that it's been described as scientists as bacterial in its scale and its spread. And Damien Carrington, the environmental editor for The Guardian, in 2003 said, "Defining the Anthropocene is vital. It brings together all the impacts of humans on the world, thereby giving a platform for holistic understanding and, hopefully, action to repair the damage. From a scientific perspective, a precise definition is essential for a clear basis for debate." However, 1 year later, in 2024, the International Commission on Stratigraphy did reach a decision, and they voted not to formally ratify the Anthropocene as a new geological epoch. They have suggested that, despite not being able to agree on this, it's still a culturally significant thing to discuss, perhaps more than a geological one. Pulling away from geology somewhat, how does this relate to art and design? Why am I telling you about these things? That brings us to part 2, art and environmental imagination. So, Davis Turpin's Art and the Anthropocene outline key reasons why art is central to thinking with and feeling through the Anthropocene. They cite sensorial reasons. The Anthropocene is something that we feel through toxicity, instability, and loss. It's visualized, so we understand it through images, satellite views, climate models, data maps, and new media to some extent. And art is experimental, and they discuss art as something not bound by the same ethical frameworks or truth claims as science or politics, and they use this term non-moral to describe that. So I just want to point out, I think it's very relevant here that this paper that we're discussing, it's an introductory chapter to this book. This was written in 2015, which was 9 years before the ICS rejection of the epoch. So at this point, they were still thinking that perhaps this would become a geological age. And who knows, maybe in the future it will be. So Davis and Turpin begin with this quote from Henri Cartier-Bresson, who is a photographer. "The world is going to pieces and people like Ansel Adams and Edward Weston are photographing rocks." So Cartier-Bresson is speaking during the American Great Depression of the 1930s, and Davis and Turpin interpret Cartier-Bresson as calling for more socially engaged art practices. They describe a move from photographing rocks to photographing people. So you see down here on the left, the aforementioned Ansel Adams, Frozen Lake and Cliffs. And then on the right, you have the construction of the Beijing University swimming pool by students. And this is by Cartier-Bresson himself. We can see two further examples here. So we have Pepper number 30, which was photographed in 1930 by Edward Weston, and Migrant Mother, 1936, which you probably recognise, Dorothea Lange, and that was shot in California. Whilst one is photographing the common pepper, the other is engaging with the plight of the Great American Depression, documenting this mother's seeming desperate contemplation of the welfare of her family. So by using this backdrop and using this as a framing device, Davis and Turpin seem to be drawing a number of parallels, although they don't explicitly mention it. The Dust Bowl was an ecological crisis that was a big part of the Great Depression, disrupted global economies, so there was a global impact. And the role of artists was something that changed during this period, and it changed partly because of funding, partly because of the idea that actually maybe art could be useful in a different way that might be useful to the state, for example. So President Roosevelt made this New Deal. It's a public recovery program, and as part of that, there were funds specifically for artists. Public Works of Art Project in 1933 and the Federal Art Project 1935 to 43 hired thousands of artists to depict the American scene. These schemes even supported artists like Jackson Pollock, Lee Krasner, and Dorothea Lange, who are now household names. Similar to the Anthropocene, the drought known as the Dust Bowl of the Great Depression also left evidence in stratigraphy. However, unlike the Great Depression, the challenges of the Anthropocene bring existential threats on a global scale, intertwined with forces of globalization, ecology, ecological collapse, and the complexities of the digital age. So what features of art do Davis and Turpin suggest employing to address these apocalyptic futures? So I'm not going to go too much more into this, but a key factor is social engagement. They point to interdisciplinarity and collaboration. They talk about ethical and data-driven themes and methodologies. And time becomes something that they believe artists are focusing on and artists should be focusing on. And in particular, they seem to coin this term to become geological. So this means that art is no longer just reacting to social or cultural events, but to deep time sediment, exhaustion, and decay. Now, as we see when we go through these different projects, there is somewhat of an irony here, because the idea that Ansel Adams was just photographing rocks was a kind of discussion of a lack of social engagement. However, to become geological seems to suggest that actually we want to talk about rocks again. And that is exactly what we will end up doing, which I'm not sure if it was an intentional irony, but it's certainly an interesting one. So let's look at some of the examples which are mentioned in the other chapters of Art and the Anthropocene. So here we have Ecosystems of Excess by artist Pinar Yoldas. So this is reimagining a real site, which is the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It is socially based and discusses consumption and pollution, and it is based in the future in a kind of post-human biosphere. And this is a quote from the artist. "If life started today in our plastic debris-filled oceans, what kinds of life forms would emerge out of this contemporary primordial ooze?" And you can see here it's a kind of sculptural installation imagining that kind of life form. Becoming Aerosolar in 2015 by Thomas Saracento is also concerned with the future, and it reimagines human life after rejecting fossil fuel-based travel. So Becoming Aerosolar would realise a third alternative future in which civilization is truly solar-powered but also liberated from the Earth's surface to become airborne. And that is a quote from the artist off the website. Now, something to mention here, and a feature that we will see in a lot of these projects, is that it has almost a kind of moral and ethical concept of being co-created and participatory. So it urges visitors to build their own lighter-than-air sculptures. This is a quote. "Museo Aerosolar has invited people to build a floating aerosolar sculpture from reused plastic bags. It relies on open source knowledge sharing, ecology articulated with diverse people and institutions worldwide." And this is a key part of the methodology. Next project by artist duo Mix Rice. It's called Plants That Evolve in Some Way or Other from 2013. It's a 2-channel video, and this dips more into the documentary style project. It's engaged with real sites across South Korea, and it records the displacement of plants and people due to development. Now, a slight departure from these, but also in a similar time frame with similar themes, we have Public Smog 2014 by Amy Bolkin. This is set in a real site, again, US airspace, and it has a social stint to it as well. It's an attempt to submit the Earth's atmosphere for inscription on UNESCO's World Heritage List. So this is engaging with policy. This is stretching the idea of what art is and what it can be. It's a kind of conceptual journey into whether artists can actually begin to change the way that institutions function, and imagine different ways that we can classify things such as monuments and atmosphere. So all of these are kind of speculative futures. They're data visualizations to some extent. Some of them are documentary. They're mostly socially engaged, and they engage also with new media. They reimagine real spaces often. They attempt to create some kind of process of democratization through either the internet or with participation or co-design. So, I made this kind of simple Venn diagram. The term art science is quite common. Artists all around the world realize that, we are in a trend of art science. You get a lot of funding in that space. And ethics is kind of pulled into that. All of this comes from a kind of critical design, critical theory approach. So we couldn't talk about these things without talking about Dunne and Raby. This book, Speculative Everything, from 2013, is a foundational text in speculative design. And although it's not mentioned by Davis and Turpin, I do believe that it is a big, the term speculative art, I don't think that I read it. They do use the term speculative, but not speculative art. Or design. So design is not only to solve problems, but it's also to kind of ask what if questions about alternative futures. And in this respect, it takes on a kind of utopian angle. It's emergent from critical design movements and advocates for public engagement. Here we can see their 2010 project called Foragers, and this is a speculative design project which imagines future humans adapting to food scarcity via wearable biotech. This is responding to imagined conditions of overpopulation and climate crisis in the future. And I should mention also, these are examples not mentioned in the book, Art and the Anthropocene. These are examples which I think really exemplify what they're talking about that I've pulled from other places. Some of them I've been to, like this one, for example. Artists, Semiconductor, it's an artist duo, and this is their project Earthworks from 2016. It is data visualization, and Semiconductor have acquired seismic data captured as a result of land shifting and forming from all over the world. Earthworks is a 5-channel computer-generated animation which creates an immersive experience of the phenomenon of landscape formation through the scientific and technological devices that are used to study it. So it's a kind of unusual reapplication of these scientific instruments, right? So they would have been used to detect these land shifts, but instead they're being used as models to create something new, which is an artwork. This also has audio tracks which go with it, so it's very immersive. Now, so far, most of these ones which I've shown you have been really inside the gallery. So you may be thinking, this is really fine art based. This is really in the gallery based. And that's why I wanted to pull this example in from Olafur Eliasson, who is collaborating here with geologist Minnick Rosing. And this is called Ice Watch. It's a series of installations between 2014 and 18. It's experiential and public. And the idea is that the ice blocks were fished out of the sea after they became detached from ice sheets. It's a result of global warming. And here we can see they've been transported and placed outside the front of Tate Modern, which is in London. This is a nice quote from Eliasson. "Put your hands on the ice. Listen to it. Smell it. Look at it. And witness the ecological changes our world is undergoing." And it really is experiential. You know, it's visual, but it's also the temperature changes. Obviously, it's wet, but also it engages sound. As it's melting, it makes these kind of hollow thud noises, which are quite haunting. And you have several of them around. So it's almost like a kind of percussion orchestra that's playing around you. Now, we couldn't have this discussion without discussing the work of Edward Batinsky, photographer, who actually has a project called Anthropocene. It's, again, within this fairly narrow time period that all these projects seem to be coming in. 2015 to 17, documentary style work, and it's photography. And on the homepage of Batinsky's website, it says, "Over 40 years of bearing witness to the impacts of human industry on the planet." So these photographs are huge. When you see them in a gallery space, they dwarf you, and it becomes kind of an experience in a way that photography often doesn't. If you want to make photography an experience, make it really big. That's my advice. So this one is called Coal Mine 3. It's from Germany in 2015. This one is Phosphor Tailings 12, and this is in the USA in 2005. You don't get a great sense of scale here, but it's an aerial photo, so it's very large, and this is pollution, this is contamination, right? Here, nickel tailings, number 34. This is in Canada, 1996. And this bright red, the unintended output of using nickel, this pollution, this change of environment that the humans have brought about, side effect of our industries. I'm only going to speak very briefly about Terra Fluxus because, strictly speaking, it is slightly on a different theme, right? Corner is talking about often more related to urban form, urbanism, but somehow is grappling with similar issues, but from a landscape perspective. So talking about urban expansion and overpopulation, ecological instability and climate change, and the degradation and fragmentation of natural systems. It's interesting however, that even though it's a slightly different discipline, there are still similarities in the way that he advocates for dealing with these things. So, for example, projecting alternative urban futures, cross-disciplinary collaboration, ecology, architecture, engineering, and art, and new visual and technological tools, e.g. mapping, GIS, diagrams, and using these to really generate alternative imaginaries for landscapes. So, bringing it back into the realm of art, who better to do this than Liam Young, so architect and filmmaker, and I believe a professor at SciArc in California, and I think used to work in the special effects industry in Hollywood. Very well placed to deal with these types of concerns that Corner is discussing. So this is a speculative artwork called Planet City. It really captures my imagination, and I really urge you to go and watch the TED Talk and the film. It's a kind of world-building exercise. It imagines a single, continuous city housing the entire global population of 10 billion people, so that the rest of the Earth can be left to ecological restoration. So the idea is you put everyone in the world into one city, and then we leave the rest of the world alone. It's very science fiction. It's not just this computer-generated animations. It also comes with these other side projects like costume design. In terms of the time, it's described as a techno-utopian fantasy and a work of critical architecture. So again, we're in the speculative space and we're also in the critical space. It's data-based, grounded in statistical analysis, research, and traditional knowledge. And it's collaborative, working with acclaimed environmental scientists, theorists, and advisors. Now, I wanted to put my project in here because I think that this fits pretty well with this theme. It's an unusual project because I was hired to do this by a lithium mine, a commercial lithium mine in the UK. This project is called Power from the Blazing Stone. It's from 2021, so it's a podcast, but also a computer game. Here you can see it in Seoul Museum of Art, where it was exhibited a few years ago. The site, they're real sites. They're various mines across Cornwall, which are currently functioning. And it's based in the future, a mysterious wild future Cornwall, which is an area of the UK, in which a human girl and her robot must mine to survive, and they also have to learn about the ethics of mining. It was a really great collaboration, and it was a really interesting project to do. The collaboration, which was part of the brief, was to collaborate, first of all, with Cornish Lithium as a company who funded the project, and I was working with exploration geologists and geochemists from Cornish Lithium, and they're listed down there. Also an arts organisation called Deep Earth Synergies. And then, as part of my team, I pulled in game designer, Purple Black Digital, a well-known Cornish actor, and I pulled in musician Cornelius Link. So when exhibited, you can see on the right there, it's a remote control that you use to navigate this landscape. There are environmental controls. So when you go into certain parts, for example, clouds will form from dry ice and move through the space. Part of the brief was that it had to be driven by real data, and the data was incredibly diverse, and it took a lot of thinking from me to decide how I was going to tie all of these things together into a single artwork. The history of Cornwall, their mining industry goes back into prehistory. You know, it goes back into before records began. It's a really essential part of their culture. So there were antique maps and diagrams, huge masses of them. There were even quite emotional, sometimes historic minor testimonies and letters to employers, even from children. So children as young as 9 could be pushed down miles under the surface of the ground, and many of them died. I think the average life expectancy for men was around 30. And then coupled with that, there was a lot of 3D scanning data, digital data, really cutting edge technology that they were using. They were using drones and they were scanning these mines in Cornwall, but also the entire landscape. And I think that this is why it kind of fits quite nicely with James Corner's Terra Fluxus, because it is a reimagining of the landscape and it is using real data. So I pulled this data into the computer game, and the landscape that you navigate is very intimately based on, and in most of this, it needed a bit of cleaning up, but it's pretty much the data that they collected. It is the landscape they connected. You know, I believed that they wanted to find the best ecological way of mining, because if we are going to transition to green energy, we have to do more mining than ever in order to extract the materials to make the technology to do it. So their point of reference was really, if we have to do all this mining to survive, surely you want ecologists to do it, right? So here you can see different people who I worked with, and I took quotes from them. I talked to them. We went for ice cream, and they became featured as characters in the story. They proofread the scripts. They suggested plot points. So this was really made co-creatively.
Power from the blazing stone. What ain't been grown must have been mine.
So we have the video here. I'm not going to play the full thing, but I will leave the link. And you can see here that you navigate through the landscape and you're spoken to by this actor and you're told this story, and it's all relevant to their ecological mining practices. Now, I would like to go to an in-depth case study, and I'm going to show you one of my projects. It contrasts to the previous one because that was a private commission. This one is a public commission, and it differs in several ways, and you're going to see how. It's about a decade old. It's 2014, so it's neatly nestled at the beginning of this period of projects which are being discussed by Davis and Turpin, and it actually is 1 year before their book was published. The artist is my public art studio in South Korea, which is called the Bite Back Movement. It's a public commission by the city of Daejeon, and it reimagines real sites in Daejeon, South Korea. It's really a speculative storytelling, imagining future utopias and surviving apocalyptic dystopias through art and design. And, you know, I haven't discussed the distinction between art and design in this talk. I'll be honest, I don't think it's a useful distinction, and that's why I won't speak to it. So, here you can see some more examples of the work that was produced. The outcomes of the project, it was a highly educational project. So it was 5 weeks of educational workshops in the city of Daejeon in South Korea, 5 storyboards, 5 speculative products, and 2 exhibitions. The first exhibition was in the Korean Research Institute of Standards and Science, and the second exhibition was at Central St Martin's College of Art and Design in London, UK. So this was highly collaborative, highly participatory, and the co-creation was expansive. So you can see there in the center of the diagram, that's my company, the Bite Back Movement. On the left, there's Central St Martin's, and they were involved in the project. Not only did we exhibit there, but we had artist and designer alumni and students come to work with us as collaborators. And then on the right, you have all of these institutions, these governmental bodies. So the first one is Daejeon Metropolitan City. The second one is Daejeon Arts and Culture Foundation. Then you have the Artians Foundation, which is an organization which receives funding from them. There's KAIST, which is kind of like MIT for Korea. It's the Korean Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. And within that, there is a lab called Lab Renaissance, who we worked with for manufacturing. So here on the left, you can see Central St. Martin's, which was one of the gallery spaces. And on the right, you can see one of the buildings of KAIST. It's actually not the building we were in, but it's a nice building. And that is where the workshops were based. 5 weeks of research, lectures, workshops, seminars, and making. And I'm giving you a kind of overview here just to kind of simplify it out, because it was quite a complex process. So it took months of planning with the institution employees, with the city council, the funding bodies, agreeing what we would and wouldn't do and how we would and wouldn't do it. The two creative directors were myself and Sengyeon, who are the co-founders of our studio. Then there were 4 other Central St. Martin's artists and designers. And in stage, you can kind of see the bones of it here. Stage 1 was ideating and deciding the parameters. Stage 2 was the kind of pedagogical section of it. And then stage 3 was the exhibition installation. Now, add to that local Incheon High School students. So we introduced them in stage 2, and that was really the crux of the entire project. It was really about teaching. It became really a teaching project. Then add to the mix at least 10, how many have I got there? Yeah, at least 10, and at sometimes more, institution employees. So from the City Council, from the Arts and Culture Foundation, they would be kind of present at these, kind of moving through, asking questions, getting involved, in some respects, changing the shape of what was happening. And then imagine on top of that, we were making a film at the same time. So there was a filmmaker who was being directed and managed and worked with simultaneously. So it's quite a complex beast, what's going on here. Let's jump in specifically to the education part. So in stage 2, there were lectures. Most of the lectures were given by the creative directors and the artists and designers. Then there was research. So for example, for site research or social research, where questionnaires were being used or places were being explored, we would go off in our groups and the filmmaker would be kind of directed between these groups. Then for the rest of it, the ideating, the storyboards, the designing and the making, we would separate into our separate groups. But of course, it was a collaborative atmosphere and we were all kind of helping each other out. So the parameters that we agreed beforehand, the artists and the scientists got together and the areas were decided largely by the type of work that the scientists were engaging in their studies: genetic engineering and symbiosis, air pollution and class, mental health technology, fashion consumerism and augmented reality, harnessing kinetic energy in the city. So the lectures and seminars, they really were the bulk of what we were doing. It was 5 weeks of contact time with these high school students. We were teaching them from design research types, site research, social research, materials research, action research, surveys and data collection, how to make infographics, ideating, narrative theory and storytelling, foresight, Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, presenting techniques. Here you can see they're presenting the graphs that they made from the research they conducted, and manufacturing techniques, etc. So here you can see some of the activities. On the bottom left is site research. The top right, you can see the storyboards being illustrated. That's a 3D print she has on the top left, and installation on the bottom right. There were lectures, as we've discussed, seminars, and other activities, site visits. We took them to museums. And we had this kind of specialist insight from Arup Architects' Foresight team. They have these cards called Drivers of Change, and it's almost like a kind of ideating game. They can be used in order to kind of make different scenarios which have been predicted by scientists. And then obviously we have a whole institution of scientists with us that we can pull on to discuss how this could be extrapolated into characters and a storyline and products. We were teaching about character archetypes. Here are 2 characters that were made by the students in my group. So you've got, I think it's called So you've got Mingu on the left, and he is a businessman, and he's very tired, and he kind of hates his life. And then on the right, you have his grandma, who's retired, and she kind of loves life. And she's like, for some reason, they put this kind of bowl of Coca-Cola on her head that she's kind of constantly drinking through a straw, and she refuses to wear the protective gear which Mingu wears and everyone else wears, because she's kind of old school. And that is how they decided they would tell this story. All of the storyboards are quite extensive. They were telling proper stories. Here are just a few action scenes that I pulled out. You can see some of the science being explained in the middle top. This is the team. Yep. And this is the product that we made. And so this is the mental health one. This is about bullying and mental health crisis and neuroscience in the future. Here you can see them drawing their storyboard. Some of them were quite touching, They wanted to talk. We weren't telling them what they have to talk about, but they were identifying things that mattered to them. So this one was about suicide, which in Korea is a big issue, and this was really an outlet for them to discuss this. This is Helen, who works in the fashion industry and working with augmented reality with these students. And the idea is, they created this clothing which it actually functioned in the exhibition space where you could put it on and you could go through different costumes that you could wear instead of buying lots of new clothes and throwing them away. So it's engaging with this idea of waste. And Helen was working with a vision engineer who created this. You can see it installed at Central St. Martin's. And this one was quite a touching story about class and technology and air pollution. So the idea, this is called the King's Mask. The idea is in the future, not everyone can afford the same levels of coverage to protect them from pollution, right? So you have this homeless man he is unable to afford the big mask, which it's not really functional, but it's like a peacock, it shows the how rich the person is and how they don't really have to work because it's not really functional. Bubble in the exhibition space, bubbles come out of it. And he can only afford this one, which the kids designed, which was a moustache, which you put on, and the moustache clears the air. And it's a love story between the rich woman and the poor man. And in the end, he convinces her, if you wear the moustache, then you can be more active and we can go on better dates. This one from Pipe's group was a very interesting exploration of unemployment and kinetic and renewable energy. And the idea is that the shoes have special soles in them, and when you go running, it generates electricity, and then homeless people or unemployed people, or even everyone in the future, if we have a future of leisure rather than one of work, they can sell this power back to the grid. There's some there's some architecture and some urban form in the top right. You can see that they've made a building that looks like a giant poo, which I approve of. And here is the film. So I won't play this all now, but I will add the link. That brings us to our final section, reflections and provocations. What is this art doing? We're engaging with these crises of the Anthropocene, but why and how? What's the point? So the first thing that I think is important to think about is when you have a lot of participation and co-creation, there's a lot of different motivations in the room. The focus may not always be making a good piece of art. In fact, often it's redirected to other things. So I would say myself, Sungyeon, the other artists and designers, KAIST students and scientists, all of us wanted to make something cool. That's why we did it. Something for the portfolio, perhaps. You have the high school students, and more importantly, you have their parents. And the parents are expecting their kids to be educated. They want to make sure that their kids are learning something. The institution employees, there's outreach, promotion, and then the filmmaker we paid. Think of it from a more institutional point of view. The institutions all have motivations too. So my company was fairly young at the time. We wanted to make great artwork. We wanted to make exhibitions. We wanted promotion. We wanted new projects. Then you've got the universities, St. Martin's, KAIST. Well, it's good for recruitment. It's on 2 university campuses. They both get an exhibition. And then you've got all of these, the metropolitan city, the sponsor, the host, all of these organizations, it's city branding. And often people, and if you only take one thing away from this whole lecture, this is what I want to really get you to, maybe you already understand, but this is what I wish a lot of designers and architects and urbanists would understand. They think about art as free. And, Davis and Turpin, they talk about this idea of non-moral, the same constraints don't apply. I'm sorry, look at this list of people that we're co-creating with and tell me that there are no constraints here. Artists have highly, highly complex briefs. And I've worked as a designer in all kinds of companies. My briefs as an artist are often more restrictive and more difficult than anything that I've encountered working in an advertising firm. Artists have very strict briefs, right? People use artists for things. That's important. Now, what was the experience like? Was it successful? So it was a school, really, right? It was a school. I think this might be a useful source to look at. Pedagogy of the Oppressed, 1968. And this is from Paulo Freire. And this concept of critical consciousness. So this idea that actually what we need to be doing with education, public pedagogy, and this has been applied a lot to the art space, this idea of facilitating learning to critically analyse and transform inequalities in your own social, historical, economic and political situations. So the Anthropocene, I believe that this trend that we're going through of the art space turning into a kind of school space, it's this idea that we need to change something quick, so we've got to educate people. So let's do it this way. It's about reflection, dialogue, and collective action. And at the bottom, I've added some kind of reflective questions for myself. So is there a shift in perspective from students, scientists, and institutions? As an artist, have I managed to change anyone's mind about how they approach these issues? Well, the students, probably, I would say. So I want to pull in Claire Bishop, and if you are interested in participation and you haven't read this, please do. It's a great counterpoint to some of the positives which are described about participation. She discusses this idea of art as a school and kind of artists becoming teachers. So both artists and curators have become increasingly engaged in projects that appropriate the tropes of education as both a method and a form. Lectures, seminars, libraries, reading rooms, publications, workshops, and even full-blown schools. Bishop raises this idea of anti-aesthetic and the aesthetic of de-skilling in participatory art. So the idea that the community groups are making the art rather than the artist, actually. There are tensions here between quality and equality. Democratization and institutional change. Let's go back to Davis and Turpin, right? So they talk about this idea that art is experimental and it's not bound by the same ethical frameworks or truth claims as science and politics. And, they don't say outside of institutions, but I think it's kind of implied here, right? Of course, that's often true. That is often very true. But not in publicly funded art, I would argue. So back to artificial hells. Bishop describes the situation in which contemporary arts has a preoccupation with consensus over individuality and collaboration with an existing ecology of organisations, being pulled into something that's already kind of in motion in many ways. However, artistic models of democracy have only a tenuous relationship to actual forms of democracy. And this is a really interesting point that Bishop makes. It's somehow trying to replicate a kind of democratic understanding of, how society should be, right? And it begs this question, is this art by committee? And is art by committee a good thing? So also to throw this in here, there are also other modes of doing co-creation. Design Justice, for example, from Sasha Costanza's Shot from 2020, discusses grassroots co-creation, and it's an exploration of how design might be led by marginalised communities outside of institutions. So the artist role. Davis and Turpin state that art in the Anthropocene must emerge from cross-disciplinary collaboration. And they talk about, and the artwork that they draw on has collaboration between artist, curator, scientist, theorist, and activist. Again, jumping back into artificial hells, it's a bit more bleak when Bishop describes it. The artist is conceived less as an individual producer of discrete objects than as a collaborator and producer of situations, while the audience, previously conceived of as a viewer or beholder, is now repositioned as a co-producer or participant, framed within a tradition of Marxist or post-Marxist writing on art. Is it the role of the artist, for example, to be a teacher? Fact versus fiction. So Bishop talks about the fact that artists in non-art spaces, and talking about all of these different social issues, often the artist operates from a position of amateur enthusiast rather than informed expert. I guess that's where the collaboration comes in. In that respect, are we presenting data? Or are we making kind of pseudoscience? I want to counteract this. Spaces of Hope by David Harvey. Harvey advocates for utopic thinking. He talks about art and fantasy and fiction not as a space of escapism necessarily, but spaces where the novel and fiction can be an exploration of possible worlds, and they've now become primary sites for exploration of the utopian sentiments and sensibilities, and warns that actually the left wing has kind of cooled down on the idea of imagining the future and utopias. So I think that actually in this respect, coming up with these stories, I think that the participants and the co-creators really, it probably has instilled some utopian thought in their approach to things. I just wanted to point out some more recent scholarship on the future and the apocalypse. So, for example, Hartog in Regimes of Historicity 2015 talks about the future as increasingly unimaginable, feared and deferred. Zizek, I hope I'm saying that right, in Too Late to Awaken, talks about the future as being colonized by catastrophe, climate collapse, AI, dystopias, and authoritarianism, and warns that we risk accepting dystopia as inevitable rather than struggling for change. Jonathan White, in the long run, talks about a crisis of futurity and is a little bit more focused on politics and short-term thinking. In our conclusion, sorry, we have overrun a little bit. Let's return to this idea of art, science, and ethics tied together. I would like you to think about these questions. The role of fantasy versus reality. Pseudoscience, is it helpful? Who takes artistic agency? Does participation increase ethics? Individual versus collective? Equality versus democracy? Can art or artists make alternative futures whilst co-creating with funding bodies? It's a really under-researched area. It's ripe for research. So, in conclusion, these days, and in this kind of sliver of time we've been discussing, art can be so many things and do so much. It can be an experience. It can be pedagogy. It can be data, visualization, and it can be futures with the Oh, I've just noticed it. There's a fat pigeon on the bottom right. So in my opinion, the role of art, particularly in this age, is not to provide answers. As Bishop says, I'm not a scientist. I don't want to give you dodgy science, right? But to keep ethical imagination alive. That's how I see it. And I want to leave you with this quote. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Frederick Jameson. Imagining alternatives. Imagining better. Or imagining worse. But persuading people. I think that that's what artists can do. And perhaps my final thought will be, artists are going to do it anyway. you know, a lot of these projects were already happening way before academics were writing about them and funding bodies were trying to think of ways to make them happen. You know, artists will do it. And I think that what we need a bit more of is a bit more freedom for artists who, in many cases, have sacrificed quite a lot to be artists. So I hope that you enjoyed the lecture. Here's a bibliography that you can look through, and please reach out to my Harvard email if you have any questions, and I will be seeing you on Wednesday. Thank you so much.